so much, everyone, for coming. I'm hopefully going to be a light touch moderator. I'm going to open it by introducing everyone, and I might move some questions around the table after that. But hopefully these people will be doing all the talking. So on my left here is Robert Curgenven. He's an Australian artist living in Cork who sculpts volumes of air with sound. His work uses sound as a physical field of perception to engage our physical experience of our embodiment, how our bodies inhabit space, and the psychological shaping of time and duration by the auditory. For Robert, sound is weather, affecting currents and microclimates within discrete architectural volumes of air and across topologies. Through sound, his work entreats us to feel and to hear air. His live performances, installations, and album releases span pipe organ through to feedback, immersive resonances via turntables and custom-made vinyl, as well as carefully detailed field recordings from remote areas in Australia where he lived for many years. His double album, Climata, recorded in 15 of James Turrell's sky spaces, transformed these architectural light installations into resonating sound installations that brought the air within into a distinct relationship with the air outside each sky space, providing cues to topological, meteorological, and socio-cultural context. The Wire surmises that, quote, behind the music lurks such disparate presences as Alvin Lucier, King Tubby, Murray Schaefer, and Eliane Radigue. None of whose names I googled before this, so that was a struggle. The second of our panel, Natasha Bourke, is a recent fine art graduate using analog and digital AV-based media, performance, sculpture, light drawing, and installation as language in her practice. Gathering, whether visual, audio, text, or trope, and studio play are core to her process, and critical analysis. Incorporating the resource materials, her body and landscape, Bourke's work is immersive and intricately layered. Our third speaker is Dr. Jenny Butler, a lecturer in the study of religions department here in UCC, where she teaches on contemporary religions in Ireland, Western esotericism, and new religious movements, and was formerly a lecturer within the Department of Folklore and Ethnology. She conducted the first ever ethnographic study of Irish contemporary paganism, and her book on the topic of 21st century Irish paganism, worldview, ritual, identity is forthcoming from Routledge. Also forthcoming are some edited collections of hers, including Folk Metal, Critical Essays on Identity, Myth and Culture, and The Twin Peaks Phenomenon, essays on a show both wonderful and strange. Dr. Butler is currently working on a comparative ethnographic project on non-ordinary or supernatural beings and landscapes, which explores the interconnections of worldviews, customs, and sense of place as intangible cultural heritage. Her key interests are religions and national identities, and the study of new religious movements and emergent religious traditions in an Irish context. And then our final speaker, Dr. Barbara Murphy, is in animal science, the Animal Science Equine Programme Option Coordinator within the School of Agriculture, Food Science and Human Nutrition. Having worked for leading equine organisations in the US and Ireland, Dr. Murphy combines expertise gained from both her academic equine science background and equine industry experience to oversee a relevant, highly competitive degree programme. Following a BSc in equine science from University of Limerick, she spent a year working within the thoroughbred industry in the US and Ireland before pursuing a PhD in veterinary science at the Gluck Equine Research Centre, University of Kentucky. Her scientific research relates to studying the clock genes that control biological rhythms in animals. Specifically, her studies investigate how circadian rhythms are involved in important reproductive phenomena and how disruption of these rhythms impacts growth and performance in the equine athlete. So now I'm going to invite each speaker to speak about their own work and the ideas that they have that kind of orbit the exhibition and the themes of the exhibition for maybe kind of 5 to 6 minutes before then moving into a kind of fuller panel discussion. So Rob,
ladies first.
Barbara, do you start?
No pressure. Thank you very much. So it's great to be here. It's a very different aspect of lighting to what I spend a lot of my time working on. So my relationship with light is through learning about chronobiology, which is the science of biological timekeeping, and how every single cell in our body and in our animals' bodies and in anything that evolved on our planet is influenced by light and the light that our eyes perceive. And in particular, there are a number of biological rhythms that are of interest for health and science and welfare, and both for human health and animal health. And those rhythms are daily rhythms or circadian rhythms, which are 24-hour rhythms. And then the annual rhythms that control reproduction, molting, hibernation, different seasonal affective issues that humans also suffer from. So light is very much more important than just our ability to be able to see and to visualize. And when light enters our eyes, it stimulates receptors at the back of our retina. And in particular, in the recent years, we found that blue light is of most highest stimulation to these receptors in our eye. And the reason for that is because sunlight has a huge, high proportion of short wavelength blue light. So for that reason, being out in the sun is good for your mood. Looking at LED blue screens after dark is not so good for your health. So the wavelength of light and the color of light has a very important effect on our physiology. And for animals such as horses, they use light to determine what time of year it is and what time of year is the most suitable time for reproduction. So seasonal breeding animals use the duration of day length to tell them it's time to breed, so that they time their reproductive cycles to activate so many months before when the offspring will be born. So for example, sheep and horses are both seasonal breeding animals, but sheep have a gestation, a pregnancy length of 6 months. So their reproductive system is stimulated by day length getting shorter, by the winter long nights. That's when they start becoming reproductively active, so that 6 months later, there are lambs born in time for the spring. Horses have an 11-month pregnancy, so they have their activation of their reproductive system occurs as the days get longer during the spring, so that 11 months later, their offspring are again born in the spring. Why does nature want offspring born in the spring? Long days, more grass to eat, a better environment to escape predators because there's more visibility. So all of that is down to their perception of light. And how this is controlled in their body is the receptors can tell when the blue light is on, when the sun comes up, and this controls another set of hormones that regulate their reproductive system. So that's kind of the background on seasonal breeding. But in the thoroughbred industry, where we breed horses to become fast race horses and to make lots of money at the sales, and we're very interested in that, particularly in Ireland, what we've realized is, well, I blame a man in the 1800s who decided that the 1st of January would be the universal birth date for all horses. So just like you want to have your 12-year-old make the under-12 football team, but they've got to be born at a certain time of the year, it's the same with horses. Because January 1st was chosen, yet most foals are born in June, people figured out if we can put the mares in the stables, leave the lights on until 11 o'clock at night, then after a couple of months their reproductive system will kick in so that we can breed them earlier than they would normally be bred, and we can have January foals. So we manipulate their seasonal breeding by changing the light that they receive. And this works really well. Right now all around the world in stud farms there's mares standing in boxes with lights on, and the lights go off at 11 o'clock. That long day length stimulates the receptors in the eye, changes the reproductive hormones, and it works. But the problem is, from working on a lot of stud farms, horses are meant to be outside. They're meant to be moving. They're herd animals that are outside constantly moving. And to be less stressed, they like being in a herd. To be more healthy, they like to have exercise. So what I wanted to know was, why can't we give them this light stimulus but allow them to also stay outside? And my interest in chronobiology and the fact that blue light was the most optimally stimulating light to the biology of the horse made me wonder, well, what if we just give blue light and only give it to one eye? Would that have the same effect as the animal in a stable with lights shining on both eyes? So that gave rise to what is the Equilume light mask. The idea being that now, all over the world, in the last week, people are fitting these headpieces on their mares, and they activate it with a magnet. We learned very quickly not to put an on-off switch on a live animal in a field. The light comes on at 4 o'clock every day and it turns off at 11. It's just on one eye. And people go, why is it only on one eye? If you have a valuable mare that's worth hundreds of thousands of euro out in a field in the dark with light shining on both her eyes, things are going to go wrong and she's going to walk into ditches. But having light on one eye and their eyes are lateral means that they have visibility on the other side and can behave normally. So this was the reason and all of that background behind the light mask. Thankfully, they have taken off. It's very hard to change a traditional industry and get them to think about doing things in another way. But the really nice spin-off of it is the horses are healthier, they're behaving naturally, they're outdoors, and they're reproductively cycling right when the breeders want them to be. So that's my story. Thank you.
Jenny, do you want to go next? And just so you know, the mics are on at the thing, but I think we've got pretty good vocals here, so your own choice.
Can people hear me okay? Or should I use the microphone? Use it? Can you hear me? I come from a folklore background, as Ciarán was saying, and I moved into the discipline of study of religion. So I've always been interested in the integration of the two, how religions and cultures intersect, and the way people think about things and how that influences how they live their lives. So cosmology, how people think about the world, or worldview, so people's understandings and values and beliefs. And I'm interested in light and darkness and different perceptions of those in different worldviews. I research new religious movements, especially contemporary paganism, which is an umbrella term for lots of different so-called magical religions or nature-based religions, and often the occult, occultism as we call it in academia, Western esotericism. People often associate that with the darkness, and the connotation is that darkness is something bad, so that the dark arts or the black arts is something to be afraid of. But the word occult relates to the eye. So ocular and what's hidden from the eye, and I'm also interested in the kind of the native Irish or traditional Irish worldview and how that relates to modern religious systems or belief systems and ideas. And in the native Irish tradition, we have what's called the second sight, so seeing into the other world or the spiritual realm. So the spiritual realm is associated with light and with brightness particularly, which is strongly associated with Judeo-Christian concepts, which I'll come back to in a second, but also with the native Irish religion or mythology, with the pagan world. The spiritual world is associated with brightness, and was described in the medieval manuscripts as a bright paradise. So it's very difficult to know whether it was the Christian scribes who wrote down the stories and the ideas about the old gods, whether they were filtering things through their own worldview or not. So those are things we can't really answer, but it's quite interesting to compare other manifestations of otherworldly beings and divine beings and so on. So I mentioned the dark arts or the black arts or the craft as witchcraft is known. Part of my research involves different types of pagan witchcraft, so modern forms of nature-based spirituality and the practice of magic. And within paganism, there isn't the same, generally speaking, the same dichotomy between darkness and light that you find in the Abrahamic faiths. So Judaism, Christianity and Islam have quite similar ideas in that regard. But in paganism, darkness and light are part of a cycle. So the year, the Celtic structure of the year is divided into a dark half and a light half, with the year emerging out of the darkness into the light. So the winter solstice, which will be on the 21st of December in the Northern Hemisphere this year, is when the light penetrates particular sites like Newgrange in County Meath. The dawn, the rays of the rising sun illuminate the chamber. So there's many different symbolic associations with what for modern pagans are still sacred sites, living sites, in that they're used for ritual on the landscape, and they have various connections with darkness and light. So the year emerges out of the darkness at Samhain, which is became modern day Halloween, and then into the spring at Imbolc or Imbolc, which is the old Irish and modern Irish names to do with perhaps Imbolc means ewe's milk, and Imbolc means in the belly. So springtime associated with lambs and brightness. So similarly, the cosmology, the way of thinking, darkness isn't necessarily bad, but light is the fruition of something, So seeds in the darkness of the ground come out into the light. Babies in the womb are born out into the light of the world. So for modern pagans, light has associations with spiritual illumination, with otherworldly beings as well. But darkness isn't the opposite, or it's not a negative contrast to light. It's part of one thing, a spectrum. So just to mention, I won't talk for too long, but just to mention about the Judeo-Christian ideas about light, and where the idea of darkness being bad or evil might be coming from and influencing other worldviews. So I mentioned fear, or ideas about darkness or blackness being bad. So in particularly in the Judeo-Christian cosmology, heaven is associated with light and hell with darkness, but the divine light or divine radiance is associated with not just learning, like a certain type of intellectual, like a contemplative process has to do with divine communication, but that divine light, a certain type of light, is God itself. So by extension, bad spirits, demons, are in blackness. They are without light, and certain beings, spiritual beings, whether they're dead humans or not, can be put in places of darkness because they're separated from the light of God in heaven. So one example of that is for example, in Roman Catholic theology, you have limbo, which is a liminal place, a kind of indeterminate place between heaven and hell. It's not hell, but it's dark. So it's in Irish, it's described as Dorcadus gan bhíon, so darkness without pain. So it's a separation from the light. So and there's many descriptions in the Bible of the divine, whether it's Jesus or God, well, one and the same, but different manifestations by way of light or fire. So the burning bush, or the transfiguration of Jesus, where he kind of bursts into rays of light on Mount Tabor, and Jesus saying, "I am the light of the world." So you have all these very positive associations with light, but contrasted with darkness. So I think that's really impacted on how people think about darkness and light as two very separate things, whereas in other understandings they're part of one circle or cycle. So that's what it has to do with my research. Thank you.
Hello. Natasha Bourke. I have an interdisciplinary practice and extensive background in movement. I often say, the story I tell myself now is that movement has got me into all the disciplines that have followed. I predominantly use film, installation and performance in my work. But it's not just movement. Light is fundamental in my practice, and I suppose using film and photography, it's obviously very important there, and then I need darkness to view the work most of the time. I also, in my performance practice, have a mask that I've been using for 4 years, and which was originally designed as a filtration device, if you will, which kind of tunneled my vision, which is kind of interesting, seeing the horse with thinking of the blinkers, and was originally although it's evolved now, as things do, it's in its meaning and will continue to filter out the information that we don't need or can't cope with as we grow older, or with overstimulation from excessive attacks of stimuli with technological development. And just as we grow older, we develop a handy knack for we have to just leave out the stuff we don't need. With this mask, the core means I have to navigate in space, because I'm essentially blind, is light. And during the day, it would be just light I can see, just shapes, shadow and light moving around in that space. And then in time and its involvement, I've also, even though it was originally designed as a filtration device, I suppose is it a human need, maybe not just my need, hopefully, to populate space. I've started to use the light inside of this mask, and I'm completely blinded by light now if I use that light inside, and so it's kind of interesting how it's evolved in that way. I've also started in my practice, my performance practice and filmic performance practice, I would use a lot of, make use of different spatial modalities, including projection. I would use suspension quite a lot, so I would suspend of anything I can. I use harness work quite a lot in my work. I'm also very drawn to and continue to investigate being in a womb-like space, kind of investigating different suspended states, both mentally and physically. So I hope at some point in the future I'm starting to research making a performative and installation piece in a pool-like context or on the water. And water is very important, but it also has a very interesting play on light for me, and projecting onto that. So it's just layers upon layers upon layers. But I've recently just come out of 2 big performance works, one of which I was using this cone in a suspended state. So I was not just walking around through and feeling my way around, I was suspended also. So really throwing myself off and investigating this unknown space. And I don't know where it's actually going. The meaning often, I wouldn't call myself necessarily conceptual artist, because I start with the image and then the meaning will come. And I might think I know what it means before, and I might have some language around that, but it's always changing. and I'm disabling myself instantly if I say it means this. But it was interesting to be invited on this talk because I'm about in my actual workspace to move from a very cavernous-like space, I call it my woman cave, my studio, which is very dark, and it is a very affecting. I'm quite happy to go there in the winter, obviously, and during the summer I find it very difficult to go there because I'm going out of what I need for my mental health and my practice. And I'm about to move to a very bright space, so it's going to be quite a shift in my daily practice. And just with regard to my own circadian rhythm within working, I think a lot, I don't mean to generalise, but a lot of artists might relate to being more night owl than a lark, you know, operating better in, I find, because I'm very sensitive during the day, the busyness of the world, I find it hard to tap into my right brain. Maybe my left brain too at times, but I find it easier to tap into that at night for whatever reason. So I'll just finish there for now.
Okay, I'm just going to maybe draw a bit of a red thread between what the three ladies have said. My strategy worked, so I don't have to introduce ideas. So I'm not really going to talk about my work. I'm probably just going to talk about what I do to people, and by extension of that, what I do to myself quite a lot. So I'm going to be largely talking about bodies as we exist, not just our mode of being in the world, and also that we are bodies in space. So like at the moment we're just a bunch of meat packets sitting in a room listening to a bit of meat flapping down the front. So how we find our way through the world, how we build systems of knowledge around this, like epistemologies, light being an important part of that, as is sound. And so context is a very big part of that. So like knowing how we exist in the world, you can't abstract everything out to the point where there's no context. So I'm not going to talk about light as a thing. Also because of some of the work that I was doing using James Turrell's light boxes, his sky spaces, I was keen not to have too much crossover between his stuff and my stuff because one doesn't want to ride on the coattails of others. Just as an introductory concept, so we, building on what you were saying before, Barbara, how we tell what time it is partly through light, and we actually get a lot of that information through the top of our head. And then the melatonin is produced at certain times of the day that makes us sleepy, and serotonin is produced at other times of the day which makes us more awake, and it's also associated with us being happy. One thing I did do to myself quite a long time ago was on a rather extreme vegan diet, living out in the middle of nowhere, and read about the blue light effect, and that it's very hard to synthesize B12 and you're not taking that into your diet. So blue light is somehow tied in with the synthesization of B12 within the body. When you then, this is going somewhere, the B12, so when you have either serotonin or melatonin being made, there's an enzyme that's controlling that. When you disable that enzyme, then you start to being able to process this tryptophan, which exists. Cows spend a lot of their time tripping off their scones because they tend to eat grass that's very strong in DMT, Phalaris grass. Anyway, that controls how we perceive time. So if you if you're on certain drugs like monoamine oxidase inhibitors, then that's going to change the way that you experience time. So by extension of that, if you manipulate the way that we see light, or if you're sitting in the dark, or if you're manipulating pressure, which is essentially what sound is, if you consider that sound is like a discretionary fluctuation at a specific frequency or a range of frequencies, that's going to have an effect on the body. So putting people in the dark and constantly repressurizing them with very high strength, low frequency raves is kind of what you get with people at a rave. And it could be said that people would experience time differently in a nightclub for a variety of reasons. We're not going to cross over into reproductive cycles and that sort of stuff with the horses and people in nightclubs. But anyway, so also light as well as sound, helps us to work out where we are. So if you mess with these things, and this is kind of where you get to the things that I do to people and things that I do to myself, I'm pretty interested in these hardwired things, and that the body, if you look at it as a whole series of parameters that you can kind of mess with, and so you can change the way over a discretionary period of time, like over an hour. Concerts kind of have a dramaturgy to them. People will be more susceptible to certain ideas in the first few minutes, or maybe around, say, the 37-minute point, than they would be, say, around the 17-minute point. That's a much longer discussion. But then if you can, I'm doing a set at the moment, which was meant to happen last week, but will happen next year, in Cypress Avenue, where they're putting a beast of a sound system in, so 8 18-inch subwoofers, which is enough to knock things off shelves, which is something I enjoy doing with low frequencies. I'm a little obsessed with the very low end of sound. And considering also that light is 1 octave, we can hear 10 octaves, and we can see millions of colours, but we aren't used to hearing millions of colours of sound. So if we could hear the same way that we could see, we'd be able to differentiate fractions of a hertz, not just notes. We'd be able to hear the rich tapestry of sound that's going on around us. Anyway, we get a bunch of people, put them in a room, subject them to very heavily phasing, so you can literally hear the air swooshing around you, low frequencies. And then I've got some software that a friend knocked together for me that's based around Edwin Land's pioneering work with the Polaroid camera and the Polaroid sunglasses. He invented both, so he got to name them. He invented this idea that rather than using 3 RGB cannons, you can do everything using color shadows and just 2 colours. So you can make all colours with 2 colours. So basically these wildly phasing sounds that are whipping around also makes a projector go on and off, and we're very close to getting a lighting rig to work with it as well. So essentially the light goes on and off at the same rate that the sound changes. It's not a strobe, because I don't like strobes, but essentially as the sound keeps changing and you'll have a couple of things beating against each other, it makes you a little bit dizzy-ish. And the measure of achievement, I think, will be how many people fall over. So then filling the room with a fog machine, I think, will take it up a notch. So then you're literally watching the subwoofers blowing the air around, you're watching the light change colour in front of you, you're kind of looking at the inside of your head, because I either just do it with black and white, or I'll change different lights and different colours at the same time. So that there's a disorientation process. So I'm kind of interested in how we orient ourselves, how we use our senses, how light gives context. So, that you're listening at the same time as looking, that you're seeing some reinforcement from what you can hear and what you can see. I think the interesting thing, and the reason why I ended up using the sky spaces as sound installations, is everyone's just looking at the sky, but no one notices, like this room and the curved wall at the back, the acoustics are fairly mental in there. So you're hearing all these flutter effects that you're kind of abstracting out from my voice at the moment, and you get those same kind of things in Terrell's little round rooms. So yes, I'm essentially just interested. I'm not a messer, but I'm interested in messing with people's perceptions, and light being just one of many tools of pulling the conceptual rug out under the carpet. Ciarán, back to you.
Great. Thank you to all the speakers for their introductions of themselves and their work. Those are very disparate responses to light. We're going to see if we can draw a few kind of parallels between all of them. One, I guess, aspect of this that I was interested in, and kind of conversations have already kind of begun about this downstairs. We have a tendency when we're talking or considering the arts and the sciences to separate them, to talk about them as cerebral, as something of the brain rather than the body. However, every now and then you can still hear some stamping downstairs, and Natasha and Ben, or Rob, what you're doing, you're representing art as a very physical, active, embodied force. Barbara, this is the use of science to regulate something as base as an animal's circadian rhythm, how they give and when they give birth. So this brain-body split that comes across in metaphor and in discussion, basically, is this a metaphor too far? Is it a metaphor that is perhaps time to put to rest? So kind of, I guess, to the panel, whoever wants to take it first, and then we can bat it around. In your work, how do ideas of the body come into play? Do you think that this binaristic separation of body and brain is kind of, I guess, hangover from Cartesian dualism Is this something that needs to be exercised? Does this hamper the means that we understand ourselves and indeed how we think through the problems of our respective disciplines? That was a long question.
Taking that first.
So I guess drawing it to a point, binaries, this binary of the brain and the body, and how we talk about and experience art and science, we tend to load that into the cerebral realm. But obviously it's very much to do with our bodies, and our bodies are experiencing things. It's not a brain and a body, it's just one object. Do you engage with this idea in your work?
Can I grab it and run with it and chuck it over?
Cool.
I think I suffered through a degree in philosophy, and I don't really agree. Descartes saying, I think, therefore I am. He'd already presupposed that he existed by putting the I at the beginning there. So I'm not really in favour of discretionary and unnecessarily dualisms and these difficult dichotomies that come out of saying the mind and the body. I guess what I was just describing is about that you're experiencing your mind and your body, and that there's an argument that the central nervous system is the mind. So that when you when you lose limbs and this kind of stuff, it literally does change your mind. And I'm interested in trying to, using art, force people into a situation where they have to experience their mind and their body at the same time, that you put heavy parameters on it, like sit down, shut up, listen kind of stuff, and that it has an effect on the body, and then that also has an effect on the mood, and that light being also part of that, the quality of light, and then that's also going to affect the weather, so that you're a perceiving entity all the way through, rather than this abstract brain in a bottle somewhere else. So, and I think the science behind that's a useful explainer, but you can also rip things up a lot faster just using art, because you don't need to explain as much.
Yeah, so you can force an experience rather than having to kind of muddle through the explanation.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
you go to the body. I guess we still separate the body.
And everyone's body's different, that like taller people hear things different to shorter people because they're further away from the ground and the low frequencies that travel along there, and so that like ladies feel things differently to men. Gender is important, as well as how you experience your body and how you inhabit your body. So like a dwelling in the world and also a dwelling within the meat packet. I've said it.
I'll have a go at the part of the question I understood. From my perspective, it's a continuum in that mechanistically, the light that I'm familiar with that enters the eye stimulates receptors that directly go along a nerve impulse to a part of the brain that from there springs out and controls behavior centers of the brain, and every organ in the body is communicated via this line. Everything is interconnected. And the different wavelengths of light influence us so differently. I wish I had it here to show you, but we recently designed, it's almost like an installation. It is kind of artsy, but it's blue enriched white light by day that gradually transitions at dawn and dusk to red light at night. Because we manage animals a lot and interfere with them or feed them at nighttime, the worst thing you can do is turn on a white light in the middle of the night, because it abruptly suppresses melatonin and messes up your rhythms. But red light is on the opposite side of the spectrum to blue, and it doesn't have that effect. It maintains our body rhythms, but it also has a huge calming effect on behavior. And if we have like time-lapse cameras where you can see in a like even in calf sheds. So a lot of calves live together for 8 months of the year in a little shed, and we put these lights on them, and they're all active and they're all moving around, they're head-butting and they're feeding and they're just doing what calves do when they play with each other. And then the light changes and you can see it on the camera. And one by one, there was 20 calves in the shed. They just all lie down beside each other and switch off. So that is my way of tying together the brain, the movement, the light, the behavior, how it all comes together. So from a very scientific point of view, but yet it does influence our behavior, and in an installation in a calving shed.
Jenny and Natasha, do you have any thoughts on those?
Well, I think I'd have to leave that percolate for quite some time, and it really depends on the artwork, it depends on the person. There's so many dependencies. Like with what I understood of what you were saying about this physical that's very physical. It doesn't sound very intellectual, and that's not. It's like it's. I've experienced the work, and I certainly don't spend much time in my head. You know, it is extremely physical. The way I would personally respond to work would be quite sensorial, and then I might shift up to my head. Although I am a stinker thinker too, but like I would start here with my gut. I would receive it here, and then shift up there. Watching people come into, so just thinking about people coming into installation work, my installation work, because if I'm there with it, and seeing them adapt, you know, it might be quite fearful initially, or when they see me hanging from the ceiling or something like that, you know, it could be very animalistic response initially, and then it's very interesting observing that when people enter into a darkened space, for example, and watching the cognition map, create the image, and trying to understand it. So I would say, it depends on the kind of work, but if you're entering into a installation space, I would say it would be always start physical and then shift into the, you know, if you're uncertain about something. But then we want to understand very quickly. I try to not understand sometimes because it might ruin it for me. I would rather be left with a resonating feeling. I don't mean necessarily emotion, but something I can't quite understand. Like, I think I get that from, you know, it's like something that's happening to you, you know.
Collectively
vibration.
As well. You're all
absolutely.
experiencing it together, which I think is an interesting.
I mean, quite often when I'm experiencing Rob's work, I imagine everybody just starts spontaneously vomiting at the same time or combusting, and I don't mean that necessarily in a bad way. It's so physical.
Scared
or the beams of light, like Christ coming out of the you know, it's quite something, you know, but that. But observing people in that moment, what is happening? You know, it's not very intellectual, and it's certainly not answering your question. But
no, that is like the idea that the body has to check first if everything's okay before we can start.
I would
cognizing.
say so. I mean,
if you can put a stop to the cognizing, you're kind of getting yourself back in touch with those.
Well, if you step into an uncertain situation, I mean, the animal will come into play then. I would have thought our head won't be very helpful if you're in danger. You know, like initially, very initially.
I was thinking, Jenny, you mentioned that pagan traditions kind of, I guess, conceptualize darkness and light quite differently, and the Judeo-Christian conception is very binaristic: light good, darkness bad. But the way you described the kind of pagan tradition kind of figures darkness as very generative, like darkness as the womb that brings life into the light, but obviously there we have to kind of go back and there's a cycle. And we mentioned the kind of dualism before and how that's perhaps connected to Judeo-Christian conceptions of being, of I'm a brain and a body, I'm a soul and a body, there's something distinct. Is that a mindset that, I guess, through exploring these different traditions and these new religions and different ways, I guess, of kind of perceiving ourselves, our own bodies, that we can kind of work to dismantle it, or maybe dismantle is not the right word.
Well, it's something I think about a lot, this mind-body distinction, first of all, because I do ethnography, so I interview people and I take part in ritual. So when you take part in ritual, it's very embodied, and you're talking to some extent about your own experience, and also trying to analyze it, and then trying to analyze other people's experience. So I find that difficult with an embodied, like, ritualistic religion. But in terms of the Cartesian dualism, I don't think it's just the mind-body. Like, obviously that impacts on how people think about the spiritual world, or what, like, is the spiritual a component? Is it, you know, or not, so depending on the religious tradition. But for lots of contemporary pagans, they might describe themselves as animists. So an animistic kind of worldview or cosmology, that there's some kind of spiritual essence that kind of permeates everything. So the spiritual is not separate. So there's something, again, everything's part of the same cycle, whether it's inanimate like a rock, or whether it's a plant or an animal or a human being. And so Cartesian dualism it's connected also to like the scientific paradigm that we live in. But it's very difficult to try and understand worldviews or experiences that aren't separated like that. So, when you think of material and metaphysical or supernatural as different, it's very difficult to understand certain types of spirituality, especially indigenous peoples and the way they think about the world. Another kind of area that I research is people's beliefs or attitudes to, I prefer the term otherworldly or non-ordinary beings, because again, the word supernatural is associated with certain types of beings or certain types of experiences, whereas words like divine or religious are used for other things. Supernatural or metaphysical, all of those things suggest it's something that's not really part of our world, that it's some kind of but I'm dealing with worldviews where that's all intertwined. So I forget where I was going with that, but
to be fair, it was a very wandering question, so it's really easy to cover all the bases. Because of the exhibition that we're sitting in, Prism, it's not just about representing science and the work of scientists in an art gallery. It is also, has taken a significant gendered aspect. I guess all of you should have noticed the striking Gaposchkin chandelier as you arrived in the gallery this evening. So after the exhibition, that piece is going to be permanently on display in the Tyndall. The artist behind the piece, Emer O'Boyle, is the co-founder and director of UCD Art and Science, which explores the studio-laboratory relationship and how points of shared interest might be articulated through contemporary art practices. So maybe, Barbara, you might start us off on this question. As a female scientist, do you see positive changes and exciting opportunities for women working in STEM? And perhaps then, kind of secondly, in what way can artworks like O'Boyle's and the exhibition as a whole, and having these kind of discussions about embodied experiences, how can they, skipped over that, how can they create a conversation around gender in STEM and the very different experiences that women have had in sciences, and perhaps kind of glass ceilings that are not shattered, but...
Okay, so I kind of have two views on that. One is the fact that I work primarily in quite a traditional male-dominated industry, that being the horse industry, and I spent 7 years in Kentucky. That should give you a good idea. So, from a science perspective, women in STEM, I think the opportunities are fantastic right now, and there's such a push there to elevate women and give equal opportunities from primary, secondary school up into college and beyond. It's tougher to bring that scientific knowledge and push against accepted paradigms and traditions in industry. So I span the breach between academia and practical change in industry, because to me the whole point of making scientific advances is to actually have an effect in the real world, and a lot of scientists get stuck in their very narrow view of everything. So I've been lucky, it's not been easy, so I kind of, from a science and entrepreneurship point of view, the scientific opportunities are there. It's still tougher, I think, to take ideas and to make change in the industry, in industries from a female perspective. That's just from my personal experience. It's not an easy route, but it is very rewarding when you break through even a small amount. This is my first time engaging in a very interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary conversation around a similar topic, and to me it's fascinating, and you can see clearly the threads that go through all of what we do that tie it together, but you get a much different perspective, so I'm appreciating that, but it's very new and it's good, I think.
I have a kind of springboard question from that, but I'm kind of aware of time now, and we have our installation downstairs that I think at this point we'd like to direct people downstairs. So if we want to move on to the audience questions, we're actually going to host those downstairs, kind of in the backdrop of that light exhibition that you saw. So maybe we'll thank the panellists before running downstairs, but we're actually reconvening just downstairs in the Sisk Gallery, and the panellists have very graciously agreed to ask questions in that atmosphere, maybe kind of devolving this kind of panel setup a bit. So thanks everyone, and see you.